I'll be speaking with Eva Maria, who is Venezuelan. She's a socialist currently living in the United States, an advocate of socialism from below. She's a teacher who soon will be teaching Spanish literature in Boston to native Spanish speakers. She's currently in Oregon. Good evening.
Good evening, Stanley. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about Venezuela, and our jumping off point is a couple of videos. One is by Max Blumenthal. His outfit, he calls it the Gray Zone. And he was down in Venezuela at a supermarket. So you saw that video?
I did see that video, yeah.
So overall, what did you think of it?
I mean, the first, I will say, like, as a Venezuelan, like, seeing that, like, honestly, like, the first impression I had, I was offended by some of the way in which he would just interact with being in a different country that is going through what I think is a very difficult time. And his attitude was just one of laughing it all off. Like, it was not real. None of the things that have been going on are not real. And here's the proof by going to this one supermarket that is stocked at this time. We don't know what neighborhood it's in. We know that it's, a supermarket that is normally one that has people with money, which at this time is a lot of people related to the government for the most part, and to businesses as usual who are cooperating with the government. And there's no mention of that. There's no mention of where he's at. There's no, like, different supermarkets he goes to. He doesn't talk to people. Like, it felt very arrogant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he doesn't talk to any customer in the store, though he says a few Spanish sentences, so evidently he knows some Spanish. It's very popular, at least in YouTube numbers, 280,000 views. So it's deliberately amateurish to, I guess, prove how authentic it is. It's just him shopping in this big, looks like I can't say the word. It's got a lot of stuff. It starts off with some CNN video that, sort of looks alarmist. People have no access to basic commodities like nutritional biscuits or even toothpaste or toothbrushes. And at one point he mocks that whole thing.
Yeah, he does. And I think I understand the posture of, so I understand, obviously, I've been critical of the United States, I guess not obviously, but I've been critical of the United States' role in the world since I have been conscious of the United States as a thing, right? It's something that it's clear for a lot of us, especially when you're from a different place, you have access to some of these criticisms, maybe more so than people here in the United States. And that's a clear, and of course the U.S. media, you have the situation where, I mean, I never, in the Spanish media, right, I was in Spain before I came to the United States, nobody ever cared about Venezuela, even though before Chavez, right, you had this 70% of people living in poverty, you have this huge numbers of people suffering, and nobody talked about Venezuela. I just didn't even, most of my friends' families didn't know, couldn't even tell you exactly what it was. And in the United States, it was also not a country talked about. People didn't, the media didn't do anything until it was something that they could use, I think, as an example of what not to do, right? It's if this is socialism, this is what not to do, because everyone is so miserable. It's a dictatorship. It's, they use all of these catchwords that are very convenient to explain to, people in the United States and people in Europe that what they are going through is fine, right? Like, this country is fine. You're so lucky. You're great. And in fact, if you're one of those who thinks that we should support struggles from below, then look at what happens at Venezuela. This is what happens, right?
If we
And so,
could
like,
go back to the video for a second. So
Yeah.
he's there, and there everything is lots of meat, and look, all this champagne, and and then he says then he does his economics. He says, no, there's no problem of scarcity here. The problem's inflation and speculation caused by the capitalists. And then later he says it's because of hoarding. And so this is his economic analysis. So what do you think of what he says there?
I think it's a simplistic view of what's happening. I mean, I think, yes, inflation, hyperinflation is very much the problem. Hoarding is something that happens, but it's not the major issue here. I mean, also he talks about the capitalists, but he doesn't talk about how much of the government is actually the capitalists right now, right? The ones who own these businesses, the ones who have the ability to actually export things, are a lot of people in the government, and he's not mentioning that. And I think, so his analysis, but it's just, if the United States wasn't involved in an economic war with Venezuela, then Venezuela would be a prosperous country with, left-wing ideals, and it would be that kind of great example that the left wants to see succeed, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that's the case. I think the government has made some very explicit moves at points, and we can go into that, right? But at points, I think there were moves, for example, taking more control over the oil production in Venezuela. I think it's the way in which Chavez presented it, which at the time, I was definitely a Chavista at the time, it's okay, so we're going to do that, and then we're going to distribute all of this money to make sure that everyone in Venezuela is taken care of in ways that just weren't happening before, right?
Mm-hmm.
People have access to education, to hospitals. There's subsidized grocery stores, right? And those are excellent things that happen, right? But one of the problems with that model is that it ended there without thinking about what happens after, because he was able to take advantage of the situation that oil production and oil sales were at an all-time high. And you have this economic boom, right, that happens everywhere in Latin America with other commodities as well, but of course oil being such a rich commodity, right? It made it so that the possibilities of what you could do at that moment were very high. Mm-hmm. But then we also got to a situation where Venezuela deprioritized the production of the country, production in the country, and prioritized essentially exporting more and more oil.
So he made the country even more dependent on oil sales.
Yeah, and I can give you the numbers. I don't want to because I don't have the computer in front of me, but I mean it's something major. I mean, it was 70% of the of exports from Venezuela were happening with oil before Chavez, and then it went up to 96%. It is a huge increase of dependence on the one commodity that is obviously tied to the world market. Right?
And the price of oil plummeted, really dropped very much in the last, let's say, 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, it went, and I don't remember the exact year, but it went from having barrels that you could sell for $120 to going down to $9 per barrel for a while. Now it's no longer 9. I think it's 40 or something like that. But it's not gone up to 120. And that to me is one of the biggest issues, right? When you have this model, which you can call socialism, but it's definitely not the socialism that I would be for, of taking your resources and being able to distribute them for the population, like it's a good idea, but capitalism doesn't work that way. And Venezuela is not immune to global capitalism, right?
All right, let's now talk about that second video. Joanna Hausmann, and she's given the front page, at least on the website, of the New York Times, and where Blumenthal's video is deliberately amateurish, hers is very slick and a lot of fancy cutting, and she's a comedian. They don't tell you anything more about her background other than she's a comedian. So what was your first reaction to seeing that video?
Yeah, I mean, and I have enjoyed Joanna as a comedian before in some of her, like, comparing foods in different countries and, like, dances and all of that stuff. Of course, my impression seeing that video was complicated because first it was like, okay, so a lot of this information is correct, but of course the way in which she situates what the solution is and what the root of the problem is. I mean, she doesn't go too far into the solution. She only mentions Guaido. It's like 20 seconds of Guaido in a video of 5 minutes, right? What she spends more time on is actually like seeing what's happening, right? And like how bad the situation is. And that's, it's like what's hard about seeing these videos is that you see the right and you see the right having sometimes an analysis of what's happening, of like the difficulties that Venezuelans are going through, that the left, like Max Blumenthal, doesn't do. They don't show that, right? And then you see them being able to post what their solution is, right? Which is like going back to, neoliberal economics, like having just a different, like an emphasis that is against socialism, both the one that Chavez was promoting and that Maduro is promoting, but also in general, right? Going back to a country that had a strong but small middle class, that had a very wealthy ruling class, and that everyone else was just kind of forgotten, right? I mean, that's like how it's been for as long as I've known Venezuela and for as long as my parents have known Venezuela.
All right, let me talk specifically more about her video, and then first about her. Now, after the video came out, some people said, wait a second, the New York Times is not telling us about her father, that he's an important aide to Guaido, and if I remember right, that he was an economist in the olden bad days. Now, is that true, number one, and does it matter?
It is true. It is true. He's right now the head of the international, the development, what is it called, international development. I don't remember but in English it's hard, but in Harvard, that's where he's at, right? Mm-hmm. And he is for sure, he was in Caldera's government. He's definitely like someone who would benefit if Guaido got his way. And he wants that, right? And he probably genuinely thinks that's what's best for the country. And I don't know what Joanna thinks. She probably agrees with her dad. And it is important. It is important to mention it. It is important to put it in that context. That's the problem. It's like right now, it's like this is nebulous thing in Venezuela where people are like, oh, there's no left, there's no right. This is just like, these are the facts, and this is all we need to know. But there is a left and there is a right? There is like a specific type of solution that people propose. And the solution of Ricardo Hausmann, her dad, is one that we know very well in Latin America, right? Which is like going back to privatizations, going back to prioritizing the paying of the debt, and what that means for all of the social programs that have been implanted. We also know it's probably going to be, neoliberal austerity measures, etc. We know his plan. That is a That we know how that goes. We just, I don't know. It's like, so that's important.
Okay,
And I
so
think
now,
he agrees.
so now in her video, she shows some people on the Hands Off Venezuela campaign. She has some
Yeah.
video, I think, of the Washington, D.C. rally of a couple weeks ago. And
Yeah.
then she has people from Ilhan Omar to Bernie. And, she sort of
Yeah.
makes fun of them as people who are, they're soft-hearted, code pink, etc. They don't know what's going on. And you and she says, "Oh, I'm no pro-Trump hawk, but we're dealing with a brutal dictator." Now,
Hmm.
what do you think of that phrase, brutal dictator?
I think it's okay. So I think the government of Maduro has become brutal, and it has become brutal in many ways. It has become very difficult to live there. It has become difficult to even understand exactly like what can happen next week, right? Like in terms of everything, of electricity, of what food is going to be in the supermarket. If we get sick, like what hospitals to go to. Like there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think that's brutal. I think it's very hard to live in a country like that. And I think, and there's, so I would characterize that as brutal. In terms of like, is it a dictatorship? Is it not a dictatorship? I think it's hard because it has authoritarian characteristics, the regime that Maduro is leading right now. And I think that's very clear in many ways. I think we can see some of the evolution of how that happens and how like instances of, like very exciting, hopeful, popular measures where there's like, where democracy was actually expanding has been now, what is it called, like backtracked, right? It's not, like you don't see a lot of the things that were happening in 2004, 2005, but it was so exciting to go to the Bolivarian circles and all of these things, right?
Speaking of democracy, one of the points she makes is the last election was not free or fair. And
right.
What do you think of that?
I think the last election was, I wouldn't characterize it as free and fair. I do think that the right boycotted the little they had that they could actually, participate on. I think what wasn't legal and fair is all of the maneuvering that they did to make it, to have a demoralization campaign, essentially, like make it very hard for an opposition to actually form. And the only opposition that has been able to form is the one that is much led by the people from before Chavez, that nobody wants. It's like, I think that's the weakest. That's part of like what I think is making Guido, even for those who are like desperate to have Maduro gone, like people don't trust any of the people he's around, right? So I think that's what it is. It's like, I think it wasn't, there was maneuvering from the part of the government, and there was a closing of opportunities. There's other parties in the left that
maybe we could talk about that. Yeah, maybe. I'm sorry to interrupt, but maybe.
Oh, no worries.
Maybe we could talk about that now. So, on the one hand, you have Maduro. On the other hand, you have Guaido, who Trump loves. Now, what about the kind of left that you and I appreciate, the socialism from below and so on? To what extent is there that kind of a force or forces in the country?
Yeah, and that's like the tragic part, right? So I think it's very fragmented and very small. I have connections with a few, like with people who are in a few different formations. There's like people who are in the union movement, independent of Maduro. There's the ones that are like actually in the union movement inside of Maduro, but maybe organizing against him. There are, mini Trotskyist parties that have tried and not fully blossomed, but with good ideas and some propaganda campaigns. So it's not I can't say right now there's like a specific group or force to look to. I will say there's a lot of elements coming out, right? There's a lot of, the only thing uniting a lot of people is this opposition to what's going on right now. The problem is, of course, that what do we do next, or how do we move forward? And for that, I think we need to look at, for example, this summer, right? There were like all of these strikes from nurses and doctors, and like we need to look at the movement that is happening and then see where they see, like, what are they proposing, right? I talked yesterday with one of my closest friends there, who used to be in this group called Marea Socialista, and is now involved in a new sort of formation that is a little broader, that it's not a Trotskyist group anymore. Essentially, he's involved in something else, and he was telling me, it's just like things are like people are going different directions. Like one is like to the despair, the other one is to like a lot of hope when things seem to like be possible, right? There's like mass marches, and right now the mass marches happen to be against Maduro, but there's also been like he doesn't, the way in which he thinks about it is that he doesn't think that momentum will end at only an opposition to Maduro, that it would continue against Guido as well, and like policies implemented by whoever is around, and he thinks that the main thing that is needed is a new, new elections, but not the way that Guaido is saying it, like not with a transitional government. Like the thing about what's hard about all of these solutions is that everyone is stuck with how do we even get to any of it, and there's no agreement within the anti-Maduro left. Which is in and of itself a small sector. So, it's like I hate to be, I'm unclear right now. Like there's not a lot of answers, and I keep talking to people there, see what they're thinking, the people who are still there, and literally the answers of what they think needs to happen change day by day.
Well, it is what it is. So this is where things are right now, and hopefully the left, the anti-Maduro left, will congeal under a good, broad program and make some progress. Well, I want to thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you, Stanley. Thank you so much for the interview.
Okay, good night.
Good night.